Good afternoon, public. I'm Hannah, joined on a screen that you'll be seeing shortly by my sister Casey.
Hi.
And we will be presenting our 6th episode today of the Non-Existent story. Casey will be presenting 2 stories with dramatic excerpts and music for both, and it is my job to guess which is real and which she came up with out of her head. And one of us is not wearing pants. And I will leave it to you to figure out which one it might be.
We already know, so that's for
We do know. We do know.
For the listener to guess. So no one can get drinks.
I will be followed now by Casey.
Okay, so the generic category for today is the dictator novel, which is they're quite abundant in Latin American and in other European literatures, but not so much yet in the States. But we'll see. So here I go. Over the weekend, the vultures picked through the mesh wire protecting the windows of the presidential manor, so that on Monday morning the city awoke from its lethargy of centuries to the smell of rotten grandeur. Only then did the band of men dare to enter the house, where they found his body face down on the floor of his office, though it was impossible to recognize his face, even after chasing away the vultures. And in any event, no one there had actually seen him in person. They had only seen his official portrait, which even in the year of the comet was already considered inaccurate. That was the first time that they found him dead. None of them had ever seen the president in person because for a long time now, his faithful servant and perfect lookalike, Patricio, had attended public ceremonies playing the role of the president. Patricio had already survived 6 assassination attempts and had grown accustomed to living a life that was not his own. He even had access to the president's concubines and was authorized to use them as the president himself did, while the president would visit his mother under the protection of his faithful friend, General Aguilar, or while away the hours playing dominoes with other dictators from neighboring countries, all of them now dying in the nursing home he had built for them, and where they had arrived as refugees, overthrown by the people of their respective nations, each one escaping with nothing more but his life, his military honors, and a suitcase full of public funds. The president offered them his hospitality so that he might every day remind himself that he was not, and would never be, one of them, paying no heed to the filthy rumors spread by the opposition that the only reason he continued to rule was because British and American investors found it convenient. There were so many rumors, the disappearance of 2,000 children that the Red Cross and the United Nations looked for but could never find. The night he called all the generals together to a great banquet, and when the main course was brought out on a platter, it was the treacherous General Aguilar, baked to a golden crisp, 14 medals of honor pinned to his uniform, and a sprig of parsley in his mouth. Having signed official documents with a thumbprint for as long as anyone could remember, at a very advanced age, he learned how to read from his wife, Leticia. Leticia Nazareno, large of breast and flat of foot, the only woman who had ever managed to get him to take off his saber and all his medals and his pants and even his golden spurs before bedding her, so that it could truly be said that of all the women he had seen, the only ones who had ever seen him naked were Leticio Nazareno and his mother on the day he was born. The death of his mother initiated a new century of scandal and confusion. People from all over the country flocked to see her painted body lying in state. The news had spread that her soul defied the laws of nature, and an industry of holy relics grew up around her body overnight. The president wanted her canonized as a saint, and an archbishop was invited to attest to the proofs of her sanctity. When the archbishop discovered that all the witnesses to her sanctity had been bribed, the president proclaimed his defunct mother a civil saint and declared war on the Vatican. The second time that they found him dead, the body was in the same office, lying in the same position and wearing the same clothes, and had also been picked over by vultures. The only difference was the group of men who found him. So many years had passed that no one among them was old enough to remember how it had been the first time. All they knew was that no evidence of his death was decisive, for there was always another truth behind the truth, although they knew by now that the first dead body had in fact been that of his faithful servant and perfect lookalike Patricio, the same Patricio who had also told the president about the rare beauty of a certain Manuela Sanchez, who lived in the neighborhood of the Howling Dogs. The president had all the dogs shot so that he might visit Manuela unmolested. He brought her compasses and snow globes and quartz paperweights and other gadgets, overwhelming her house with gifts, until one night Manuela vanished into the piles of useless objects and disappeared forever. He never found her again, and he was heartbroken. He wanted to die, but it had been foretold that he would never die of love, but rather peacefully in his sleep, sometime between the ripe old age of 107 and 232. And the following excerpt occurs towards the end of the story. And for this, I would like to play a song to accompany it. This is Garota de Ipanema. He stayed on alone in the deserted house of his absolute power. We would find him sleepwalking, stumbling among the devastation wrought by the animals, with no one to command unless it were the blind, the lepers, and the cripples, who were not dying of disease, but rather of age, among the weeds and the rose bushes. And yet he was so lucid and so stubborn that whenever we reminded him that he urgently needed to put his inheritance in order, he only responded with evasions and postponements. For he would say that thinking about what the world will be like after one dies was just as pessimistic as death itself. Because when I am dead, he would say, the politicians will return and dole all this stuff just like they used to do. You'll see. They'll come back and distribute it among the rich people, the priests, and the Americans, and nothing for the poor, of course. Because the poor will always be fucked. And the day that shit is worth something, the poor will be born without asses, he would say. Or else, dying of laughter, he would joke that for the 3 days he would be dead, we didn't need to carry his body to Jerusalem to bury it. Settling the matter once and for all with the argument that it didn't matter if something wasn't true before, it would be true in due time. He was right, of course, for there was no longer anyone who could question the legitimacy of his story. No one would have been able to prove or disprove it when we weren't even capable of identifying the president's body. There was no other nation than the one he had made in his image, with its space changed and its time corrected according to the designs of his absolute will, reconstructed by him in the gray fog of his memory as he wandered around lost in that house of calamities where not a single happy person had ever slept, while he tossed grains of corn to the chickens who pecked the ground around his hammock and exasperated the servants with orders to bring him a glass of lemonade with crushed ice, which he would then leave untouched, to take that seat out of that corner and move it to this one and then put it back again, satisfying in this petty way the dying embers of his enormous addiction to power, passing the leisurely hours of his command in patient excavation of the ephemeral moments of his distant childhood, while he nodded off to sleep in the shade of the terrace, waking up with a start when he managed to capture a memory that formed a piece of an infinite puzzle of the nation as it had been before his rule, that great and illusionary nation without shores, a kingdom of swamps and slow rafts and cliffs even older than him, when men were so brave that they hunted crocodiles with their bare hands, driving stakes between their jaws like this, he would show, and shove his finger against the roof of his mouth. That is the end of story one.
Most excellent.
So story two, in a similar vein and style, the idea to make the sentences always as long as possible. A crowd had gathered before the tower in expectation of an appearance by the chief marketing officer. The murmur of voices interrupted only by the squawks of the purple flamingos in the Italian fountain, whose soothing and luxurious splish-splash confirmed the transparent and yet eternal boundary separating the CMO from the people, and the people from the CMO's daughter Anna, today dressed as a vampire in recognition of the solemnity of the occasion. The CMO's eulogy, however, did not entertain the people as in days of old, perhaps because this time there was no enemy to blame but gravity. And so the crowd began to lose interest until at last the platform bearing the body of the fallen window washer was lowered onto the podium from above. And the house lights all lit up, and the CMO and daughter mournfully embraced, cueing the Philharmonic Orchestra to strike up the national anthem at an accelerated tempo, the honor guard to hurl their sabers, the women's Olympic gymnast team to somersault across the stage, and then the CMO's daughter threw herself atop the coffin. Fireworks exploded over the bay, and the security personnel ushered away the family of the fallen hero. After the ceremony, the CMO and the CMO's daughter retreated back into the atrium of the tower, past the installation art, the massage parlor, the business center, which requires an electronic keycard to enter. Though since the power shortages following the workers' strikes, the great empty tower ran on generators that left little power for anything else besides illuminating the spectacular public appearances of the chief marketing officer. who sometimes appeared before the people as a strong, powerful woman, other times as a strong, powerful man, and no one remembered which one was the original, and some said it was a man voted into the office, who then dressed as a woman to secure the women's support in subsequent elections, while others said it was a woman who had to play the part of a man in order to secure her influence abroad. But even up close and in natural light, no one could tell, not because the costumes were convincing, but because both genders looked so equally artificial, which, as the fortunes reminded us Mondays through Wednesdays, such categories were. Though some of us believed that the CMO had transcended the category of gender altogether, though they were in the minority. For what would marketing be without the target demographic of gender? In the absence of electricity, we were forced to manage our nation's brand image with scraps of paper the size of fortune cookies that we called the fortunes, each one containing little quotes accompanied by images of popular celebrities. Every night from the heights of the tower, the fortunes rained down in a torrent of white paper upon the city. Monday through Wednesday, the fortunes encouraged diversity in the celebration of all identities and a call for slow and systematic reform within the current limits of the law. But from Thursday through Saturday, the fortunes contain desperate shrieks and xenophobic rants and calls to arms and messages or images that imply, when they did not directly state, that the electricity crisis or the water shortage or this or that epidemic disease was the fault of some group of foreigners, provoking many people to form violent gangs. But then late on Saturday afternoon, just when the lynching or the pogrom or the stoning or the burning in effigy of some group was about to take place, Sunday came, and with it the fortunes containing coupons, some of them really quite good deals, and everyone ran off to shop because the coupons were only good that day. And when they had bought many things at remarkably reduced rates, they collapsed exhausted and awoke on Monday to capture in the wind the little fluttering fortunes containing messages of acceptance and self-expression and reminders to resist the patriarchy and above all not hurt anyone's feelings. And thus the hate and fear of the people was allayed, and their discontent redirected, and they passed the afternoons debating the affirmations of the slogans that whirled in the breeze around them and fell into their hair and their recently purchased bird baths and their discount kiddie pools, forgetting for a while the hunger and the darkness and the massacres and all their tedious little domestic tragedies. Or so the CMO described it to us in our weekly team dinners, assuring us that the fortunes were producing precisely the intended effect. Our people, he would say, or she would say, are a most political people, and they must never be discouraged from participating in politics. It is our job to ensure that they are informed enough to participate. And so the CMO would always make sure that whatever the crisis, the people were never deprived of their fortunes. And here's the excerpt, which should be accompanied by the Frank Sinatra version of Girl from Ipanema as soon as I find it. So give me 1 second.
Take your time. I'm still trying to catch up to the first story. You are going at a breakneck pace.
Am I talking too quickly?
Very quickly. It's good. It's very good, but I'm just trying to follow.
Oh yeah. Well,
I don't have many questions before I make any decisions.
That's fine. I am in a fast frame of mind right now. I think it's the job applications that kind of put you on edge. Sinatra, Girl from Ipanema. Okay, here we go. And avoid the advertisements. One night, the CMO, dressed in tasteful mauve business to evening casual, arrived rather later than usual to the team dinner, explaining that the delay had been caused because Anna had to be tucked in and hear her bedtime story. And of course, though many of us wondered why a 27-year-old woman still needed to be tucked in every night by her parent, we all adopted the sympathetic expressions of understanding fellow parents, though none of us had children. Then Fernando, the CMO's personal and extremely good-looking assistant, cautiously expressed his concern about the contradictory messages being rained down upon the city every week. He feared that the office of the CMO might lose its credibility, that we would only confuse the people instead of communicating with them, to which the CMO responded, "There is no such thing as communication. Communication is a myth, a pretext, whose only purpose is to confirm the tribal rituals and hierarchies with the effect of conserving the sacred principle according to which one man, invested with an absolute power, tells people about things, and the others read or watch or listen to him in a state of absolute submission. To communicate something to someone is to deprive them of their freedom, and this country stands for nothing if it does not stand for freedom. Whereupon the CMO took a swig of Riesling, and after a brief and perplexed pause, we all clapped. The word freedom was always our cue to clap. And then the CMO continued explaining how the most important thing for anyone who works in marketing to know is that no one needs your information. Nothing you do is necessary or valuable to them in any way, and your job is to never let them suspect this fact, even for a second. You must maintain a social fiction that they need to hear what you are telling them, because if this social fiction of informational need is ever destroyed, new and undoubtedly worse social fictions will come to take its place. The CMO concluded, and we all nodded thoughtfully, as if ruminating over the wisdom of her discourse, and then delved into the roasted lamb with mint sauce. The end of that excerpt. The story continues. My original goal was to make the entire thing one sentence.
Well, that, yeah. Many, many thousands of conflicting and supporting and differentiating clauses, I think, would be appropriate for both of these stories, especially the second one. I need a moment.
Okay.
So these are to make sure that I am understanding for myself as well as our 2 or 3 listeners that we're understanding the story.
That's optimistic.
So this is in the genre of the dictator novel.
Yes.
As you said. Both of which have Latin American influences as up until now, at least in modern, what we can think of as modern history, that's the part of the world that's had its most tumultuous relationship with dictators, as opposed to extended ones like in Russia, for example.
Yes, I know it's difficult. I mean, every country has had them, but for some reason, the genre. I think that what happened was that the kind of what's called the boom in Latin American fiction, where you have these great novelists who all go on to get Nobel Prizes later, and they have this incredible market, and it overlaps with magical realism, and that kind of coincides historically with a lot of dictatorships that from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s into the 80s. And so I think that's one reason why, while so many countries have had dictators, the dictator novel as such is like definitely associated with Latin America. And it's a strange thing to try to summarize because there's not a sequence of events necessarily. It's a highly descriptive genre. And it's a character portrait that it's of this larger than life national figure, and of course there are other people at play, but it doesn't have a sequence of events. It tends to just be kind of more descriptive, which makes it a challenge to summarize.
Yes, it was a challenge to even follow the summary of. I will say this is very good. So. The takeaways that I got from this story, from both stories, I will say, is that I am sure that they're inspired, or your utilization of them is inspired by what is going on in modern politics, and this a presidential election year. So in the first one, the biggest takeaway that I got between it's more they're both about the dictators, but one is more about the dictator's persona, and the other one, while it includes a description, a very, very clever description of the dictator's persona, is also more about what he creates and leaves behind. It's more about the world that he's trying to create versus the world, I should say, the world he's creating and then inflicting on other people in his strategy, versus one where it's the world that he has already created and is decaying around him as he himself decays. And so they're both dystopian, of course, but
yeah, no, I think that the first one, the sense of decadence, and especially this, from the, I mean, it already says of rotten grandeur in the very first one. So there's this sense of someone who's dead and just won't die at the same time, and it's quite gothic almost. Whereas the second one, the elements of at least structural decline are not as overwhelming. But that has to do, I think, also with the setting, because if you have kind of like a skyscraper, like it's not going to fall apart in the same way that like a plaster mansion will fall apart. It'll just kind of like little electronic bits of it will stop working, and there'll be these disconnects, and there'll be like a lot of cover-ups of all the problems with images, as there are in both cases. They're both kind of concerned with manipulating the truth or manipulating the image.
Very much so. And I think that's important within this genre. So I guess I try to approach these stories in how one is a more apparent influence on what might be your writing versus the other. But this one is very difficult to approach in that way, because the first one makes me think of what I am also sure you read all the time with different medias about Donald Trump. That's what it made me think of. Not that I want to talk about him, because I get enough information constantly assaulting me about him, but the bombacity of the character. So what does it say? For 3 days he would be dead, but then he would come back. So the relationship between him and a holy figure that is always dying and then coming back again, like the first time he was dead versus the second time, he's got a very kind of all-powerful, or at least in his mind, all-powerful, and then in the minds of his subjects, a persona of at least semi-omniscient power. And then all of the...
Yeah, like the appeal to you always have to kind of make yourself into Jesus in these historically Christian countries, which are pretty much all the countries in the Americas. More so than like even in Europe, where Christianity is like more recent. Like for us as nations, is that we've always been Christian nations, and so you do have to appeal to to Christ's image. I mean, you see it with rock stars too, like Bono or or Creed. Like there's something known in rock music as like the Jesus complex, and so I think that they need to appeal as in some sense transcending mortality. But they kind of do that maybe in different ways. And yeah, I mean, I think that obviously, yeah, of course, the Trump phenomenon, while distasteful and you know, the more you talk about it, the worse you make it. At the same time, I think understanding that we as a country are just as prey to cults of personality as other countries that we might have as a nation looked down on, like Venezuela for having Hugo Chavez, or Argentina for having Perón, or you know, any other number of like these big personalist regimes. Like we're becoming, as a nation, we're running the risk of becoming prey to a very kind of cheap populism that is normally associated with Latin America. So yeah, it works in many contexts.
It does. It's very brilliant in that way. And then of course it focuses in the first story on his relationships with people.
Particularly with women, actually.
Particularly, yes, with women. Although there's that brilliant segment where he feasts on a general that he has baked and then had pinned with 14 medals at a dinner party, which is incredible. And his wife, large of breast and flat of foot. His mother, surrounded by holy relics. And of course, back to Trump again with declaring war on the Vatican, which seemed very, very relevant in that way.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of hubris. I mean, again, like because that's what I think one reason why you need this kind of breakneck stream of excess and abundance, and I think that's why the structure is important. These extremely long sentences that just kind of like
overwhelm you.
Yeah, that overwhelm, because it's all about excess in both of them, and not only excess of objects, because usually there's like a background of deprivation, but excess of behavior and overreaction, and it's quite hyperbolic, I suppose.
Yeah, so that was the jump between the two. So in one it's excessive behavior, and in the second it's excessive information, none of which is relevant, and very deliberately so. So you have the desire for nothing to be as it appears to be, and then the negation of meaning. which I've always found very intriguing. So you have artificial appearances and identities. You don't know if the CMO, who is the leader of the second story's dictator, is a man or a woman. It is unknowable and in some ways perhaps unimportant. What is important is marketing, or the nation brand image, as you said. And then this utilization of the fortunes, which I'm picturing, you go to the top of this tower and you kind of release these little fluttering papers of propaganda, and their subject matter varies depending on the day of the week, which makes me think of Facebook, because you have these people, they're constantly uploading like the Bernie Sanders side, and then encouraging people to be, you know, like social progress and positivity. I don't think that's a word. All things that are positive and good, but then bashing all things that they're against. And then the people who are very much the opposite of all that with their very ardent arguments. And so on the one hand, it's a call for love and passion, but a vindictive one if you're against it. And the flip side, which is a call for fear and anger and lynchings and mobs. And then before either can accumulate, you have a distraction, like an ad that would pop up in your feed about a very good deal that you can get with these coupons. And that's all that the people really care about. And then everything is calmed down, and then the cycle repeats itself over and over again. And this is a vital process for this system to work. And the only way that people can maintain in it, and they do, and I mean, you could approach the second story, I think, especially in so many different ways. There's a critique on so many different things. And then, of course, there's the CMO, Mr. or Mrs., male or female's extrapolation on his or her philosophy of information. And I noticed this in a lot of debates where someone will try to it's obvious when they do this, is instead of trying to take an argument head on, they'll change the definition of a word. So you make words meaningless in order to manipulate them however you want. So it doesn't any longer matter what is or isn't. It focuses instead on perceptions. And this is very sneaky and kind of slithery. So the CMO saying there is no such thing as communication. Redefining words, and then he goes into his, or she goes into her philosophy. No one needs information, but they need to believe that they need information because it's only a tool of manipulation. So they were both very clever and very well. I don't know.
Well, I was just a response to your very nice summary of that. The second part, I think that this idea that politics is primarily performative, especially mediated politics that we see or hear, and that it is basically, you know, entertainment and a distraction. And there are real issues that are at stake, but that's not what's being debated. What's being debated is much more kind of a bread and circuses sort of thing. But I think what I find interesting in that particular part is this idea that the left creates the right and the right creates the left, and this big cult of distraction. And this idea that there is no such thing as as an inherent meaning, that it's something that's kind of constructed and always subject to reinterpretation and recreation. Like, these are actually very radical, what would be considered far left positions. And what's interesting, I think, in that scene is that they're coming from someone who occupies the role of a dictator, essentially. And so you have what would be considered a far right figure mouthing, or at least expressing or disseminating in this private circle, at least, a radically far left position on how like public discourse works. So that, I think, is kind of like the weird dissonant part of all of that.
And then both, of course, are accompanied by kind of a slow, slinky Latin music backdrop. which I also liked, because it seemed, especially in the second one, such a contrast to the breakneck speed in which things are disseminated but no real substance exists. And for some reason, the daughter is dressed like a vampire, which I love the introduction. That's the best. the bizarre morning of a fallen skyscraper whose killer was gravity.
Well, it's a window washer.
A window washer.
Yeah, a window washer. Yeah, well, the girl from Ipanema is, Ipanema is the beach in Rio, in Brazil. And Rio, someone once told me that, there's two major cities in Brazil. There's Rio de Janeiro and there's Sao Paulo. And Sao Paulo is like kind of like a New York City. It's like a business capital, and it's quite hideous, frankly. And it's all highway and skyscraper, and it's always changing. It's always being built up, and some little historic building will be crushed and a big like high rise will come up overnight. There's a lot of money circulating in Sao Paulo at all times, and huge rifts between the wealthy and the poor. And then Rio, because it's a beach town, has this kind of timeless quality. And I think what appealed to me with this particular kind of song, and it's, the two versions that it had, is that it has this kind of timeless, spaceless quality. And it sounds like elevator music to us now, because it has become elevator music. So there's this sort of like meaningless background, like you're on hold with a credit card company or something. It's just totally been evacuated of meaning and change. It's like, da, 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 da. Well, we're sorry for this wait. Like that's kind of like the sense that it evokes. So without any disrespect to Tom Joaib and all the good musicians from Brazil, but it evokes a timelessness. I think that's why I liked it.
Oh, man. So yes, but after that discussion, I must, and I feel that you have other things that you need to get accomplished after this very quickly. So I'm not in a rush. No,
there's no rush. I mean, I'm going to Book of Mormon.
I know, and I'm very excited that you're going to see it, and I'm jealous because I would love to be seeing it again. It is so good. But I know that you'll enjoy it. We should talk about it after you watch it.
We will. And we can tie it back into your Mormon story.
Or create another one.
Yes. It seems to be quite the rich mine of story making possibilities.
Oh my goodness, the things that I have learned that I wish I could incorporate, but that is for a later discussion. I must now determine, first of all, which of these you wrote, and well, this is very hard because I have no idea. I feel like this is your forte of genre, and I am at a complete loss. So this is purely guesswork.
The run-on sentence.
But yes, the run-on sentence, the Latino influence, the culture and the history between the dictators and the people that they dictate in those parts of the world. Yes. However, I must decide, and you've given me no clues. You should give me a clue.
I can't. No, I'm surprised. Actually, I thought it would be. Easier.
No. However,
hey, I had to guess yours without even listening to the excerpts. So.
I know, but I did offer. Yeah, I have no idea. I have no idea which one you wrote. However, I'm going to say that you wrote the first one.
And I wrote the second one.
Oh, man.
I wrote the second one. But I'm extremely flattered because the first one is Autumn of a Patriarch by Gabriel García Márquez. So here's you can see the general with the honors.
Does he have 14 medals on his chest?
He's partially blocked. I mean, it's a cool cover because you've got the inverted. There's a lot of things with doubles in this one. But all right, so I had a lot of trouble this week trying to come up with something. And I read these different things, and a lot of the stuff that I find myself attracted to is extremely, a check, I forgot I had this, is extremely difficult to render into summary. And this novel, it's something I've been reading for a while. And so I was like, all right, well, I like the challenge because it has no narrative. It's just descriptions of things. And it's all like, that is actually like a very organized version of, because like you find out that he's supposed to live and possibly till the age of 207 in like the first third. And then like you never know at what point you are or where in the history. So it's just, it defies summary. And I was like, well, this will be an interesting kind of challenge. And then the excerpt is my translation. So it helps when I can translate it because I can appropriate the voice a little bit more. But anyway, so Garcia Marquez, who it's also kind of magical realism, although I find it more interesting to think about as a dictator novel, because the magical realism lends itself well to excess, and dictator and any sort of political corruption is good with that. But he spent like 6 or 7 years writing it. It's quite good, but it takes a while to orient yourself in the prose, and it's mostly lists. He loves lists, like the list of the gifts for Manuela Sanchez. Goes on forever, like the list of the things that he walks by on the way to this and that, the description of the canonization of the mother, and then all the witnesses that come forth to like say what he did, and the whole thing with the children. Like there are moments, there are like episodes, but their sequence and who is perceiving and who is doing anything at any point is very difficult, because like this right here, let's show you, like, all right, so let's say that like that is one sentence, or like part of one sentence, something like that. So it was very challenging to kind of harness, but rewarding, because by the time I did all of that, I spent a lot of time on it this week. I'm not gonna lie, it was really hard. And then I was like, well, I have to try to like do something that lends itself more to a contemporary setting, in which you have a country like ours, which is driven by the market, I think, more than the state. And so to try to kind of make a kind of neoliberal late capitalism version of this, because this was written in the 60s, and to not like have too much like technology. So I had to get rid of cell phones, but then I had to find some way of like replacing how we use cell phones and Facebook and all that with print media. Which I always think like the whole world would fall apart if we didn't have electricity, because no one reads anymore. So I'm really glad that you made that connection for me between Facebook and the little pieces of paper, because that was really what I was going for. And then like some of the quotes I just got from like these super radical far left like crazy writers in Latin America, and like one of them is from The Anarchist Banker by Fernando Pessoa. Like, I don't know, it's a kind of a montage, but it took a long time, and I think I read it so quickly. Well, I always read quickly, but I read it so quickly because it just still seems so long, and I've tried so hard to make it shorter.
No. Well, I think the intention has to be to overwhelm in both stories, and that certainly was accomplished in your readings of the summaries as well as the excerpts. I was trying to follow, but it seemed at breakneck speed.
I might if I can figure out how with the video editing, I might be able to. You can slow and speed up things very, very slightly. So I might do that.
You might need to.
It's already going to sound like a chipmunk, basically. But yeah, like I'm just right now I'm also working on I would like to design a syllabus like for like an upper level Spanish class, like a university upper level Spanish class on like dictator stories or the dictator novel, because it's a very flexible genre, and there's a million. So I just bought like 3 more because I was like, oh, this is going to be my new little syllabus design project. But I'm wondering how much variety there could really be. And a lot of them just describe like the dictator from like the people's perspective, like especially the emphasis on spectacle, which is kind of what I ended up finding myself doing in the one that I wrote. But it's so appropriate for this country. Because the one that I wrote, I think could happen. I was trying to make something that I thought could happen in Chicago. And I was thinking about the Trump Tower, obviously, which I see all the time. There's giant letters that are like 18 stories high, just Trump. And it's like the way it's located, you can see it like down all the major avenues. So there's that. But then I was also thinking about Argentina, and they've a millionaire who was president of a winning football team was elected president recently. And so it's like basically like they refer to him as their Trump. And a commercial I saw came out recently, and it was like the most horrifying commercial. It was basically like, you know how you don't see it as much anymore in the US, but you know how like in the cities there'd be those guys who would run up and start washing your car windshield for you? Like homeless guys or something like that. So it shows that guy, and is this like rich white haired distinguished gentleman in like this like Italian silk suit, and he just sits there and he looks at the guy and they kind of lock eyes, and then he lets him wash his car, and then he rolled out the window, and instead of paying him, he hands him a business card. And then it cuts to the next scene, and we see the same businessman in like his office in a tower, and then a window washer comes down and we see that it's him, the original guy. So it's like the most horrifying, like, hand out more crumbs to the poor. That's how fairness in society should work. The rich should just give the poor people slightly less shittier jobs. And that's justice. It's like, it seems like a parody of itself. Like I can't even make this shit up.
That does lend itself to quite a lot of criticism and commentary.
Yeah. So anyway, there was a longer version where I talked more about like the funeral of the window washer and stuff like that. But just this idea of dying to keep a skyscraper shiny just seemed quite dystopic. But anyway, not to be too much of a downer, but I totally recommend Autumn of a Patriarch because once you get into the rhythm of it, it's not difficult to follow. Mm-hmm. But it takes a little while, and it's really quite funny at points, and it's quite bawdy too. So like, there's a lot of like really weird sexual moments that are grotesque.
Yeah, I was getting that from. I know anyone who can jump from his loving wife, the only other woman besides his mother who'd seen him naked, large of breast and flat of foot, to the mother surrounded in holy relics. This man has an interesting relationship with women.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, it's definitely something that you see in like this whole, like, at least in Mexico right now, like the big thing is like the drug lord. And there's an enormous culture around these drug lords, like, you know, kind of like Pablo Escobar, or like Scarface type figures, right? And every mafia figure ever, they always have like these super tough guys and they kill a lot of people, but they love their mother. And so there's always this like you look for their like soft, vulnerable point, and that appeals to people intrinsically. And I can see like this is from well before that whole genre of like the narcotraficante took off. But it's the same thing. It's like a guy who like literally kills thousands of children, but loves his mother and wants to make her a saint. So
he's sweet, really. It's very
sweet.
So
there's this, but he's an interesting character in because he does have these like, you never really get to know them, but you see like this intimate side. I guess that's what makes them kind of interesting as characters. So I don't know if the genre, how much you could explore it, because it seems like it would always just be based on like this one personality. And what's interesting, I think, about dictatorships or terror or anything is that there's always a social logic. So like Trump didn't make Trump, for example. The media made Trump, and the media was able to make Trump because people consume Trump. So there's this circular effect. It's never just one person who imposes things. It's always collaborative. We just don't understand how we're collaborating or how to stop.
I don't know. There just seems to be some bizarre connection, and I would be interested in making, if you were to do a class contrasting dictator novels with true crime serial killers, just to see what the comparisons might be.
I know. Could you like did you ever see The Devil in the White, or read The Devil in the White City?
No, it is on the to read list, but I haven't not yet.
All right. Well, you can't use it for this show because I'll recognize it. But it's pretty good. You'd read it probably in about a day. It's a fast read. Well, thank you for enjoying that.
Well, yes, I did. Now, thank you for evening the odds. So now we are what?
And now we're tied.
We're tied.
Yeah. So basically, I think we're only counting the ones where we make a mistake, that we choose poorly, because we generally choose well. So I missed the first one and you missed this one. Wow. I'm like very flattered. I feel like you're flattering me. My Marquesian writing skills.
Well, I do think that, I don't know how well you did. No, that's not fair. You did copy style from from your inspiration because they were so very fast-paced.
Yeah, I think that's how I throw you off. If you just read your stories really, really quickly, I won't be able to guess either.
I shouldn't even enunciate so that you're not quite sure about anything that I said. And then I must say choose.
That'd be so bohemian. You could act like you were like totally wasted and like slurring like some sort of like some sort of attic in like 1910 Paris where there's like Van Gogh there and people reading like abstract poetry. And then you just kind of slur everything.
Oh, and then this would happen, but we don't know if that really happened now, do we? End.
Or did it? Or just feign some sort of
change accents or something. No, that's getting too tricky. I don't want to overthink it too much. It already lends itself with literary comparisons to enough overthinking.
Yeah. Well, but not overthinking. I think that just generally I find it hard to sometimes talk about a book, but if you talk about two books, it becomes easier because that structure gives you a lot to fall back on, which is, I mean, I'm a comparative literature major. This is my thing. So I like comparing basically, but I think it lends itself to good discussions sometimes.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree.
You can also
Although
contrast.
I'm only English literature and we focus on just one book at a time. So I'm at a disadvantage.
No. At least several in multiple languages across time and space. But all right, well, you are up next week and I will be in Spain. So I should be all set up. I don't know. I won't have this nice mic. But we'll do the best we can. And
yes, and I will leave it to you to figure out the time changes because as we have discovered, it is not my forte.
You were so close though.
No, just backwards.
All I had to do was copy what you said and that it was right. God. All right, well, I'm gonna detener this transmisión.